Imagine Joseph Stalin sitting in the dark, cold heart of the Kremlin. The war in Europe was ending, and he felt like the master. He looked at the American diplomats and saw only weak men. To Stalin, U.S. diplomacy was just a series of soft, empty words. He believed the Americans were too tired to ever challenge him now. The Soviet leader was laughing at the world from his iron throne. He watched as the Allied leaders talked about peace and future borders. Stalin smiled because he already knew his Red Army held the land. He felt that the Americans were far too civilized for real power. In his mind, he had already won the next and greatest war. His generals toasted to a future where all of Europe was red. Arrogance was the thick, sweet air that Stalin breathed every single day. But while the politicians in Washington were busy signing new papers, a very different kind of American was standing near the front lines. George S. Patton was not a man of words or of soft deals. He saw through Stalin's smile and recognized a much deeper, darker threat. While the diplomats were laughing, Patton was quietly sharpening his steel. He knew that a new and lethal storm was already gathering in East. Stalin didn't even have Patton on his main list of serious threats. He dismissed the old blood and guts as a simple, loud soldier. The dictator believed that everyone followed the orders from the top. He assumed that Eisenhower would keep his most aggressive general in check. It was the first and most fatal mistake of Stalin's long career. A shadow was moving toward Moscow that no diplomat could ever stop. George Patton didn't look at the maps of 1945 with any joy. While others saw the end of combat, he saw a dangerous pause. He stood on the soil of a broken Germany and looked east. Patton realized that the Soviet allies were actually a new enemy force. He believed that the Red Army was a tidal wave of destruction. To him, the war wasn't over until the threat of Stalin vanished. He began to speak openly about the need to finish the job. Patton didn't care about the political games being played in Washington, D.C. He saw the Soviet soldiers and recognized the same relentless, ancient fire. He knew that if they didn't act now, the world would pay. His vision was simple: keep the tanks moving until they hit Moscow. It was a strategy born of pure, lethal, and very strategic instinct. His staff officers were terrified of what the general was saying then. They whispered that Patton was losing his mind or seeking a fight, but Patton knew that history doesn't reward those who wait for peace. He believed that the only way to stop a bully was with force. He started to stockpile fuel and ammunition far beyond his official orders. The ghost of the Roman legionnaire was preparing for a final march. Stalin's spies were recording every single word that Patton said in private. At first, the dictator thought it was just the talk of a drunk. He couldn't imagine that any American would dare to suggest such a move. But as the reports kept coming, the laughter in the Kremlin died. Patton wasn't just talking, he was actually positioning his elite armored units. A cold realization began to settle over the master of the Soviet Union. The turning point came when a top-secret intelligence file reached Stalin's desk. It contained a detailed plan that Patton had discussed with his staff. The plan was simple: rearm the German prisoners and attack the East. Stalin realized that Patton didn't want a seat at a peace table. He wanted to see the American flags flying over the frozen Kremlin. The American Rommel had officially become Stalin's biggest and darkest nightmare. The Soviet leader stopped laughing and began to issue frantic new orders. He demanded to know exactly where every one of Patton's tanks was. He moved his best divisions to face the American sector in Germany. The fear of a lightning strike kept Stalin awake during the nights. He realized that while he controlled millions, Patton controlled the lightning itself. A single man with an iron will was threatening his entire empire. Stalin tried to use diplomacy to have Patton removed from his command. He complained to Eisenhower, calling Patton a danger to the entire world. He hoped that the American politicians would silence their best warrior for him, but the more Stalin pushed, the more Patton seemed to grow stronger. The dictator was trapped in a psychological war he couldn't easily win. He was terrified that Patton might just ignore Eisenhower and strike alone. This was the Noriega trap of the 1940s, a sudden decapitation move. Stalin knew that his army was exhausted and his supply lines were long. If Patton broke through, there was nothing left to stop his drive. Moscow was vulnerable, and for the first time, Stalin felt very small. He realized that the war of the future had already begun right then. The only question was, who would survive the first and final blow? Patton's plan wasn't just a wild dream, it was a military masterpiece. He knew the Red Army relied on massive numbers and rail. He intended to use his superior speed to bypass their main lines. He wanted to strike the heart of the Soviet command in one go. By taking Moscow, he believed the entire communist system would collapse. It was the most daring and dangerous strategy conceived in that era. He spent his days reviewing the roads that led toward the east. He studied the lessons of Napoleon and the failures of the Nazis. Patton believed he had the secret that everyone else had missed then. He had the industrial might of America and the best tanks ever. But most importantly, he had the absolute loyalty of his battle-hardened men. They would follow him to the gates of the Kremlin if he asked. Stalin realized that Patton was the only leader who wasn't afraid. The Soviet dictator relied on fear to control his generals and people, but you cannot frighten a man who believes he has lived before. Patton's lack of fear made him a variable that Stalin couldn't compute. Every time Patton's tanks moved, the Soviet high command held its breath. They were waiting for the strike that could end their world forever. The tension along the new border was like a violin string snapping. American and Soviet troops were staring at each other with deep hate. One wrong move by Patton could ignite the entire world in fire. Eisenhower was desperate to keep the peace and the delicate Allied bond, but Patton was a force of nature that no order could truly contain. The march on Moscow was a ghost that haunted every single meeting. In the end, it wasn't the Red Army that stopped George Patton. It was the very government that he had fought so hard to save. Eisenhower and the politicians in Washington were truly terrified of a war. They decided that the cost of Patton's victory was simply too high. They began to dismantle his command and to take away his resources. The order was given to silence the man who wanted to march east. Patton was heartbroken as he saw his elite army being slowly broken up. He felt that the leaders were giving away the future to a monster. He warned them that we will have to fight them eventually anyway, but the world was tired of blood and only wanted a quiet peace. Eisenhower was forced to choose between his friend and the world's order. He chose the order, and in doing so, he saved Stalin's empire. Stalin watched with a cold, narrow smile as Patton was reassigned away. He saw the American Leon being put into a small and gilded cage. The dictator knew that he had won the most important battle of all. He didn't need to fire a single bullet to defeat his greatest enemy. He used the Americans' own fear and diplomacy to destroy their best hero. The threat to Moscow had vanished into the thin air of politics. But even in exile, Patton's voice remained a dangerous and sharp weapon. He continued to tell the truth about the Soviet threat to anyone. He was planning to go back home and tell the American people. Stalin knew that as long as Patton lived, his secrets were never safe. A new and final plan was being discussed in the dark Kremlin rooms. The man who wanted Moscow was about to face a very mysterious end. In December 1945, a minor car accident on a quiet German road. It seemed like a trivial event for a man who survived thousands. But Patton was paralyzed, and just a few days later, he was dead. The silence that followed his passing was deep and very incredibly heavy. The only man who could have stopped the Cold War was now gone. Stalin breathed a long sigh of relief that was felt across Moscow. Many people then and now wonder if the accident was truly won. They whisper about Soviet agents or even friendly hands in the dark. Patton's death was far too convenient for the leaders of the East. It allowed Stalin to build the Iron Curtain without any real fear. The Noriega trap of 1945 was the silencing of a truth-teller. The world's history was changed by a single truck on a winter day. The aftermath was a world divided by a wall and by deep fear. Decades of nuclear tension followed the silence of George S. Patton's tanks. We are left with the chilling realization of what might have been. Stalin's laughter returned as he saw the West retreat into its shell. He knew that the only man who understood him was buried in mud. The price of diplomacy was a century of a very cold, dark war. Today we look at the capture of Maduro and we see the echoes. We see that the bold plans of the past are still in the files, but we also remember the man who was too bold for his own age. Patton's dream of Moscow remains, one of history's greatest what-ifs. The laughter of dictators often ends when a true warrior finally arrives. But in 1945, the warrior was stopped before he could ever reach the end. In the end, we really have to ask why Stalin feared a man more than a bomb. A bomb can destroy a city, but a man like Patton, well, he can change a soul. Stalin knew that Patton represented the unbelievable spirit of the West. He feared that the Americans would realize their own power through him. The dictator's fear is the greatest compliment a hero can ever receive. It proves that Patton was right about the threat that Stalin truly was. The story of Patton and Moscow is a lesson in the nature of power. History is not made by committees or by soft and slow diplomacies. It is made by individuals who are brave enough to see the hard truth. Patton saw the truth in 1945, but the world was simply not ready. We live in the shadow of that hesitation every single day of our lives. The fatal mistake of the past is the burden of our very present now. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the mind of a terrified dictator. The realization that Patton wanted Moscow changed the 20th century forever. The world is full of these rare truths, waiting for us to find them. Keep looking behind the heavy curtain of the official history books. Thank you for spending your time with a friend who loves these secrets. Until the next revelation, stay sharp and stay very wise, my friend.